Good morning, and thank you for joining us. My name is Micheala Denny, and I serve as the Open Doors Outreach Network Education and Training Director for Voices for Florida. So the Open Doors Outreach Network employs a team approach to directly address the needs of commercially sexually exploited children and sex-trafficked young adults around Florida. The services are provided free of cost to survivors and are available 24/7, 365 days a year through mobile care and outreach. Today, we're joined by the Florida Alliance Against Human Trafficking, specifically Aaron Collins. We began this collaborative, that is Voices for Florida and the Florida Alliance Against Human Trafficking, began this collaborative webinar series last year in an effort to join and jointly focus on issues related to human trafficking in Florida and invite others to participate as well. The Florida Alliance to End Human Trafficking is a nonprofit organization created by the Florida legislature to provide funding, support, and assistance to the statewide effort to end human trafficking. Since its launch in January of 2020, over 5,000 individuals have completed the Alliance's training and awareness course. They're also focused on identifying new and innovative solutions to combat trafficking through partnerships and law enforcement. The Florida Alliance recently established a Survivor's Bill of Rights and a Speakers Bureau to provide coordination for speaking engagements and events. The theme today of our webinar is grooming and how victims of commercial sexual exploitation are lured into trafficking. To discuss this important topic, we've invited 4 expert panelists that represent a variety of allied professionals, including law enforcement, advocacy, and juvenile justice. This includes Katherine. Katherine, you want to wave and say hi? Katherine serves as the Director of Human Trafficking Intervention for the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice. She holds a BA from the University of Florida, MA from the University of South Florida, and recently completed a PhD in Public Affairs from the University of Central Florida. She served Florida since 2006 as a juvenile probation officer, trainer, researcher, and administrator. She specialized in working with youth who have experienced human trafficking, sexually marginalized youth, youth who have committed sexually related offenses, and high-profile multi-jurisdictional cases. We also have Brittany Peck. Brittany joined Shared Hope in 2018 to coordinate their annual JUST, which is a Juvenile Sex Trafficking Conference, the nation's leading conference on child sex trafficking, where over 1,000 anti-trafficking professionals convene for cross-discipline collaboration. As the Director of Training, she also manages Shared Hope's online learning, including webinars and e-learning courses. And prior to joining Shared Hope, she planned regional trade shows for the beauty industry, where she first learned about human trafficking. Brittany graduated with her BS in economics from DePaul University's College of Business. Next, we have Jamie Rosseland. Jamie is a consultant in the field of anti-trafficking work with expertise in the coordination of care and program development for victims and survivors of sexual exploitation. Development and implementation of trauma competent and survivor-centered digital marketing strategies, and has been active in local government at statewide level policy advocacy. Through sharing her lived experience and unique perspective, Jamie is committed to change the cultural view of the sex trade and address systems that drive demand. She has experience working as a survivor advocate, providing mentorship, court advocacy, and coordination of care to youth impacted by sexual exploitation with the Open Doors Outreach Network. Additionally, Jamie has presented at countless community events, statewide summits, and national conferences. In 2018, Jamie won the Survivor Advocate of the Year Award presented by the Florida Attorney General for her outstanding work with exploited youth. When not working in direct services or educating the community, Jamie also utilizes her creative and strategic eye to enhance marketing and social media campaigns of anti-trafficking nonprofits, and consults with academics on research methodologies and practices. And currently, Jamie oversees the social media strategy and digital outreach efforts for several nonprofit organizations that serve survivors of trafficking. And finally, we have retired Corporal Wilkett. Alan served with the Pasco Sheriff's Office from 2005 until his retirement last year. He has over 25 years of experience in law enforcement, patrol, Court security, investigations, crime prevention, and community relations are among the assignments fulfilled in the years of service. In 2007, he was awarded the Law Enforcement Deputy of the Year, and Corporal Wilkett holds a Florida practitioner designation in both crime prevention and crime prevention through environmental design. Alan has devoted the past several years in the fight against human trafficking. He has trained and instructed law enforcement, federal agencies, and state and local agencies, NGOs, along with multiple groups, churches, and organizations. The Pasco Human Trafficking Task Force, the Human Trafficking Commission, and Light Up the Night are current initiatives. And Alan has recently awarded the 2017 Florida Human Trafficking Law Enforcement Official of the Year from the Attorney General Pam Bondi. So welcome, Alan, as well. What I wanted to start out is that with this talk is that something that occurred to me as I was working on the discussion guide, it's that it's important that we address the issue of language we use to describe survivors of sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation. So when we talk about recruitment, it's important that we highlight the way survivors have been victimized and not complicit so that we avoid victim blaming. The relationship between traffickers and victims are complex and nuanced. So when talking about recruitment, it's important to consider how language can be used to further ostracize survivors. So I'd like to start with Jamie. Jamie, will you talk to us a little bit more about what you mean when you say recruitment and how language choice is important when discussing the topic?
Yeah, this is a webinar on like grooming and recruitment. And grooming and recruitment are activities typically that traffickers and predators engage in. And there are some times when victims are coerced into engaging in those activities as well. But inevitably, when we start having these conversations, we immediately start talking about victims and survivors and what their vulnerabilities are and so on and so forth. And when you talk about victim blaming, there's this great little video. It's just on like MTV's YouTube, but it really talks even just about how grammar is important when you're talking about who people like psychologically like blame for an action. So instead of saying something along the lines of this person was trafficked because they had these vulnerabilities, it's important to shift how we're talking about that, to put the onus on the person who's doing the grooming and the recruiting. So traffickers target people who have vulnerabilities, and that like shifts it from, oh, this person has vulnerabilities, therefore they're susceptible to like being trafficked. And it's almost like, where's this trafficker? Like, what are they doing? They're just like they're not taking a big role in what's happening. It's the victim and their struggles that's highlighted. But when you talk about traffickers targeting people, because that's what's happening, based on vulnerabilities, it just shifts the narrative and the conversation. And victim blaming is so pervasive, whether it's intentional or unintentional, or like implicit or explicit, whether they're microaggressions or macroaggressions. There's so much focus on educating youth as a form of prevention, or intervening with victim services or survivor services, that it kind of just gets to the place where it seems like these things are happening in a vacuum, and these are just individuals who are making choices, as opposed to really thinking about what's going on with why traffickers exploit people, why men buy sex, and I'll say men because I think it's like 99%, the research shows it's almost always men who are buying sex. And how do we address those things that are happening? How do we prevent grooming and recruitment from happening without putting the onus on, teaching kids how not to be trafficked, or by highlighting things that we see as like negative about teenagers instead of like focusing on their strengths. So I think that's the other thing is a lot of kids who are groomed or or end up being trafficked, by traffickers, it's because they are longing for a sense of safety, for a sense of belonging. And those are really positive things. Like someone who wants safety, someone who wants belonging, that's a lot different than someone saying, oh, they were attention seeking, or, they're manipulative. It's like, well, like if someone's manipulative, that's a really difficult way to frame that. They have unmet needs that they're trying to be resourceful in getting met. And we, may not agree with the tactics on how they're trying to get those needs met, but why aren't we asking, like, why isn't the framework, hey, what's going on with these unmet needs and how can we as a community do something about that? And I'll get into this a little bit later as well, but also the onus of the community response. So if these kids have vulnerabilities, why aren't we as adults saying, what do we need to do to mitigate these vulnerabilities?
Okay, thank you, Jamie. Alan and Katherine, I thought that it would be nice to move to you both and tell us about your perspective on this and how the language or view of recruitment might be different or similar in a law enforcement or juvenile justice environment. Katherine, would you like to go first? You're actually on mute.
Someone had to do it first. So, so I think in the juvenile justice capacity, there's two different types of recruitment that we end up having to talk about. And one is that of outside individuals, potentially adults, who are recruiting and grooming our young people involved in the juvenile justice system to get into exploitation. And what the other aspect that we have to pay attention to within the juvenile justice system is young people who are deep in the world of exploitation, who are working within their networks and within their schools, and even sometimes within our detention settings, that are acting out some of their own exploitation by recruiting others into that same experience. And those are really two different fronts in this battle. And we focus a bit more on what's happening within the system, simply because it's a little easier to try to tackle a problem that's right inside our own system, as opposed to a problem that's outside and within society in general. But that's introduced a layer of nuance, where we have to think about our individuals who have experienced trafficking a little bit differently, and we have to acknowledge that we can't talk about everybody as just good guys and bad guys, because some of the kids that we're working with in our system have experienced both sides of this exploitation, and so we have to be a bit more nuanced in our approach and try to intervene where we see recruitment taking place, but also just recognize that that's part of that individual's victimization themselves. And we can't just put that kid into a good guy or a bad guy camp anymore.
Oh, thank you, Katherine. Alan, what would you like to include?
That's a dangerous thing to unleash, is what do you have to say? So, because I will sometimes be way too blunt and certainly not politically correct. So I guess we'll deal with that for the next hour and a half. I think, and it was really enlightening and I think really good to hear both Katherine and Jamie talk about this and talk about language, because I know from a law enforcement perspective, some of the things that we deal with is that we kind of have an internal language, and then there's kind of an external language. And internal languages within systems, as Katherine described it with the juvenile justice system, and certainly within the law enforcement community, you have an internal language. And I think sometimes that internal language does not sit well when it's pushed out into the external language as well. So I think we have to deal with that. And I'll give you a case in point, because sometimes you're dealing in legal or statutory language that doesn't sit well when we're talking about interactions with victims or survivors of human trafficking. And sometimes by labeling them with what we would use as internal language, when we put that label, it really is counterproductive. in helping to for someone to come out of the life or out of that situation. So we have to look at internal language and external language, and I think that's something that within our community we have to really look at, and we have to address that and be honest about it. And sometimes that's something that we have to deal with. And I'll give you a case in point. If I have somebody who was robbed, or someone whose house was burglarized, they're a victim of theft. They're a victim of a robbery. They're a victim. And so sometimes we have to look at that when we kind of cross that over into the sex trafficking or human trafficking side as well. We have kind of that internal language. I also think it's important for us to recognize there's 4 stages to human trafficking. So we're talking about recruitment and grooming in particular. So there's recruitment. The second stage is grooming. Then there's the actual trafficking. And then there's immersion. And I think we have to recognize the language that we use in all 4 of those stages. Recruitment being where vulnerabilities are assessed, that grooming where there's conditioning that's happening for the life that's about to happen or the condition they're entering into. And then you have the trafficking where the actual trafficking, the crime of trafficking is taking place. And then to Katherine's point, you have that immersion stage. And that's where someone has been so involved in that criminal enterprise that they oftentimes will take on criminal activities themselves. And that becomes a real issue when we're dealing with it from a law enforcement perspective. If I have a bottom or I have someone who is in the life and have been in the life for quite some time, and now they're taking part of the criminal enterprise itself. So they may be committing a crime, but realistically, they're a victim of the trafficking itself. And so law enforcement culturally has to be able to change the way we look and we view some of these things that are happening. And by the way, let me just make this point, and then I'll quickly shut up for a few minutes. I still shudder at some of the language that's being used when it comes to human trafficking. I still hear within our communities child prostitute. I still hear language such as, and I think we need to quit using the word John, because that allows a certain level of anonymity. They're not a John, they're a buyer, they're a rapist. We have to start using words and a language that really identifies what's going on, and get rid of some of this language that absolutely is victim blaming, as has already been said. So I think we have to take a real look at language, how it relates to those 4 stages of human trafficking, and we have to be real about how we're using that language when it comes to interacting with those who are coming out of the life, and they deserve the very best we have and not the worst of our language.
Thank you so much, Alan. I appreciate that perspective and kind of bringing that with what Jamie and Katherine were saying. I'd like to hear also from Brittany, because you're really serving on a macro level. So, you know, what do you have to add to that discussion?
Sure, thank you. So I just want to quickly say it's an honor to be on this panel speaking with you all. You've shared some really amazing points that I'm just going to kind of add on to, but it's really great to be here with you. So first off, I want to take a moment to kind of humanize the situation of recruitment and how easily that can occur to anyone. So I just want to remind everyone that it's really important to keep in mind that we've all had situations where we've been a victim of our circumstances at some point in our life. And to take that thought and just think back to a moment where they've been like, whoa, how did I get here? Oftentimes in situations where recruitment occur, survivors have told us that they don't necessarily realize that they've become a part of a trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation situation until they're too far into it. And a big part of that is that they're not able to identify their experience specifically with what they would think is trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation. And that's oftentimes because they've seen these sensational depictions of what trafficking is in the media and in movies, where it's young girls, they're being kidnapped, they're being forced into a basement with duct tape on their mouth, and they're tied up, awful depictions, or they're sent overseas, things like that. But those depictions are more often than not inaccurate. to what's actually occurring in trafficking situations and commercial sexual exploitation in the United States. And we aren't necessarily having those conversations, or at least often enough in our communities, about what recruitment tactics actually are, what the vulnerabilities are that youth might be facing that makes them a target of traffickers, and what the trauma, and then also about trauma bonds and how traffickers create trauma bonds with their victims to manipulate them into staying in that surviving or that trafficking situation. So, and like I said before, so often we do hear from survivors that we work with that they didn't know they were trafficked until years later, sometimes even decades later, because they weren't able to identify with that common narrative that we see every day portrayed in the media. So when we're talking about trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation in our communities, it's really important that we're responsible with our language, that we are honoring the true experiences of survivors, and that we are acknowledging that trafficking can happen to all types of people of all different races, sexual orientations, and gender expressions. It can, and it does happen. And just making sure that our communities are aware that it is taking place everywhere in the United States. Another thing I wanted to add that we've talked a little bit about already is the victim offender intersectionality. So I'd just like to encourage all of us to take into consideration that oftentimes survivors in recruitment situations are victimized by the circumstances surrounding their recruitment, not their actions. We have a report that we just recently released, Shared Hope released, called the Victim Offender Intersectionality. It's the issue of sex trafficking victim offender intersectionality, which is the phenomenon of sex trafficking survivors who are alleged to have engaged in trafficking conduct. And it's a field guidance report that was recently released. It was produced in partnership with the Institute to Address Commercial Sexual Exploitation at Villanova Law, and it was informed by Shared Hope International's Just Response Council. And it focuses on shifting the criminal justice response to sex trafficking victim offender intersectionality by moving away from a more narrow view and toward a more holistic approach that improves identifying sex trafficking victim offenders, enhancing understanding of their conduct, and identifying alternative responses that take into action their own victimization. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brittany, for sharing that. And we have also shared the link to that Trafficking Victim Offender Intersectionality, a guide for criminal justice stakeholders, in the chat. So that's a direct place to go. We'll also, at the conclusion of this, when we send out the evaluation, we'll include some of these links for these resources. So it's really good to hear all of these different perspectives and stuff. And I kind of wanted to go back just a little bit and ask you about kind of how you started in this work, where it is that you got involved. And so I'm going to go back actually to Jamie, because we started with Jamie, and so we'll go back to that and say, so tell us a little bit about the work and how you got involved in advocacy in particular.
Yeah, as Brittany was talking, she talked about how often victims and survivors are unable to identify, and part of it being in the anti-trafficking movement and kind of culturally how sex trafficking is depicted. The other side of that is how trafficking, like the realities of trafficking, are actually depicted in the news and media, and often this is through prostitution stings that local news outlets pick up on, and they publish the mugshots of all these people who are quite potentially victims of trafficking, or even the criminal justice response to target individuals who are being trafficked in prostitution stings in order to try to arrest traffickers, which is a whole other story. And it's a good caveat to how I got involved in advocacy. I think one of the first major advocacy things I engaged in was I was criminalized for my victimization, and there's all sorts of studies, and there's a new one coming out of Colorado soon. I don't think it's been published, but I know some of the stats where people who are criminalized for their victimization have a higher chance of staying in poverty due to their criminal records after exiting, and a higher chance of being like re-exploited. So criminalizing victims is really complex and has lifelong consequences for those people. All of that to say, I was one of those people, and beyond that, there was also a local little newspaper that published this column called The Shame, Shame, Shame for many, many years. I think around 20 years. And I ended up in the pages of this like monthly periodic. And I have an unusual spelling of my last name, and I was out and trying to get work and all of this other stuff. And even if I was applying for places that weren't concerned about running background checks, if they Google search my name, like, there you go, there's my picture in this monthly publication that's available in print and online, and I'm never going to be able to get around that like stigma. And so the first big advocacy thing I did was I wrote a letter to the editor. I said, hey, this is really terrible for people who have been victims of trafficking. You should take this down. You should stop running this column. You should take down the articles, and you should take down like all the archives online. And they were like, oh, that's nice. We'll take down your stuff. And they did. They blacked out my name in the archives. And once again, I was like, oh, that was nice that you did that. And that's not the point. Like, I appreciate what you did for me. This is about the hundreds or thousands of women who literally can't get a job, who don't have the ability to exit or stay exited because they can't find work because their names are in these archives and their pictures. And it took a couple years, but eventually they did stop running that column. There's a new editor, and they were much more sympathetic to what I had to say. And not only did they take down all the archives, they published the original letter I wrote to the editor. And so that was my first taste of saying like, hey, what happened to me was like really screwed up. And it wasn't just screwed up that like a trafficker did this. It was screwed up that the criminal justice system responded to me in the way they did. It was screwed up that the community responded to me in the way that they did. And I just really wanted to take like that knowledge of all these missed opportunities to like provide intervention for me, or even these opportunities where like help could have happened, but like harm happened instead, and use my voice to really, change things. And it's been almost 8 years now, and just almost immediately after I exited, I got involved in some level of advocacy in it. I think to some extent I always will. And shout out to Brent Woody, who's on this call via Jenny Higgins. He helped me get my record expunged. And I still talk openly about having it, but when I go to apply for a job, when you Google my name, all sorts of like awesome stuff comes up now. And if you run a background check on me, there's nothing to find. So, and that's life-changing. It absolutely is life-changing. So shout out to Brent Woody.
Yeah, absolutely. Brent Woody actually had said it's important to note that HT actually begins with recruitment and grooming, which is something that Alan was just saying. And Jenny just wrote in and said arrest is a terrible long-term exit ramp for victims. Jamie, with that experience and the advocacy that you're doing, so how has it influenced your thoughts on recruitment particularly?
Yeah, I mean, for my own personal experience and from, stories I've heard from others, and when you start to hear about like what, made a person vulnerable, sometimes it's, before trafficking ever happens, but then sometimes, recruitment and grooming is also about people who have already been exploited, who are trying to change their lives and are, there's so many barriers to them being able to live lives that have like a good quality that they get re-exploited. And so for me, my experience has informed the thought process of like how as a community can we do better. And for me, it's not just about teaching kids how not to be trafficked, but how can we actually address those underlying vulnerabilities and how can we make systems work better for people. We can educate all day. And, I additionally, well, I know this question is coming, so I'll just stop there for now.
Yeah, I was going to say, we're definitely going to talk more about vulnerabilities later on. Brittany, so you're connected to a really large national organization. You do a lot of training around the country. We all know that. We're glad to have you here. Tell us a bit about the work you do on the topic of recruitment from Shared Hope's perspective, and what trends do you see?
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you, Jamie, for sharing with us. So at Shared Hope, we focus on bringing an end to trafficking with a three-pronged approach. We focus on prevention, restoration, and bringing justice to survivors. A lot of our prevention training is focused on awareness training, educating our youth and our communities on the warning signs for occurrences of trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation. And a big part of that is focusing on empowering communities and youth to notice the warning signs, to protect themselves. So I think so often, we want to put these tools in place to make sure that they're ready to go. We can be reactive, but we also want to focus on talking to parents and caregivers about having the conversations, empowering youth so that they know how to protect themselves and how to avoid situations of recruitment just by, when they do think, the red flags start to pop up, they know to exit that situation. We do a lot of that through our internet safety series. So right now we are seeing an uptick in online exploitation and recruitment being social media, and especially right now via dating apps, even though a lot of those have an age requirement of 18, it's really easy to get around those. So especially during isolation caused by the pandemic, when so many of us, including myself, are turning to the internet for social interaction, there's a huge uptick. So the 2021 Trafficking in Persons Tip Report quotes research from the U.S. National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, also commonly known as NCMEC, and they reported a 98.66% increase in online enticement reports between January and September of 2020 compared to the same period in 2019. And reports to their cyber tip line doubled to 1.6 million. So I think that's huge to acknowledge and understand that so much of what we're doing is hidden behind the scenes on our personal devices that no one really has access to. I think a lot of times when we're talking about recruitment, we might imagine, at least I do, because I'm a 90s kid, things taking place in our common social settings, like at the mall, and that still definitely does happen. There's definitely lots of opportunities for grooming in public settings, but I think a lot of it's taking place on the internet. So that's a huge trend we're seeing now.
Thank you, Brittany. I'm turning to Alan now. So, as a former law enforcement officer, retired law enforcement officer, and a leader in the state on issues related to human trafficking, what are some of the ways that law enforcement is approaching the issue of recruitment?
Yes, I think it's first of all a very honest thing to acknowledge that law enforcement has traditionally been reactive, and that is, there's kind of this statutory line that gets crossed, and then law enforcement gets involved and investigates a criminal act. So we're by nature, law enforcement is traditionally been more reactive. What I think is happening culturally within law enforcement that is really acknowledging the depth of human trafficking in our communities is law enforcement is beginning to look at proactive measures. And I know proactive is a term that's probably overused, but proactive in the standpoint that we're acknowledging that trafficking is not just a criminal act that happens when someone is sexually or by labor exploited for some commercial gain. We're instead saying, much to the point that was made earlier, that trafficking actually begins at the recruitment. When you start talking, exploitation is happening when somebody's recruited. Exploitation is happening when somebody is groomed. And so we have to begin to look at recruitment and grooming as not just someone who is vulnerable and being kind of lured in. We actually, from a law enforcement standpoint, have to look at that as an extension, a pre-extension of actual trafficking, because trafficking happens at the recruitment stage. So there are two things, that being number one, looking at recruitment and grooming as an extension, a pre-extension of trafficking itself, and being able to respond to it from that perspective and mindset. I think the second thing is, we know that human trafficking is a triangle. There's a triangle of human trafficking. There are three actors that have to be in play in order for trafficking to take place from a legal standpoint. So you have the victim, you have the trafficker, and you have the buyer. What I have been advocating now for years, and I get criticized often for this, and that's okay, is that we have to get more serious about going after the buyer. We have been arresting victims for years, and that has to stop. We have to stop arresting victims, and we need to quit getting under the cover of sometimes that's the best thing for them, because arresting them is not a good solution. All we've done is added to the victimization. So now there's another layer that has to be unwound. There's another thing that has to be undone that's been done. So we have to stop arresting. And what we need to start focusing on is arresting the buyer. And so my point, and I happen to testify in front of the Florida Senate, and one of the things that I made the statement there in front of the Florida Senate was that we need, and here's my view, this is not the view of anyone but me, so criticize me, don't criticize anybody else on the panel. In my view, we need to hold the buyer equally culpable for the trauma being inflicted on the victim as the trafficker. To me, they are equally culpable for the trauma. And so until we get serious about going after the buyer, I am so sick of seeing buyers get a misdemeanor, a slap on the wrist, be turned right back out into society with an NTA, notice to appear, to become a high frequency buyer just to buy again. So we need to go after the buyer and hold them culpable for the trauma that they're inflicting on that human trafficking triangle. And until we get serious about that, we're really not going to untangle the triangle. We're not going to break the triangle until we get serious about going after the buyer. So buyers beware. I think there's a movement that's being instituted that's going to go after the buyers. So I think the buyers need to be held equally culpable.
So Alan,
a felony for sex buying. I'm sorry.
Please go ahead. Jamie, please go ahead.
I was just going to say, in Texas, they just passed a law that it's going to be a felony for sex buying. So they're leading the way. There's some great people doing some great work in Texas. There's also the Houston report that was published by the Avery Center that talks about the financial risk to victims, buyers, and traffickers. And wouldn't you know it, there's very low risk, financial risk for traffickers and buyers, and there's very high risk for victims.
So Katherine, I'd like to bring you in on this because I think this is a really interesting discussion because, I was talking with you the other day and we were talking about Department of Juvenile Justice. It's sort of quasi law enforcement. It's not quite law enforcement, but it's not just the general public, human services, et cetera. So tell us about your perspective on this and recruitment, and especially kind of some of the challenges that you deal with recruitment, specifically kids who are in the juvenile justice system.
Well, to build on a bit of what my colleagues have said earlier, it's a thorny issue, and it's one of those issues that we don't like to talk about so much in our field, because it's so much easier to talk about, you know, the good guys and the bad guys. But what we see in the juvenile justice system is the young people who have made it through the law enforcement interaction, and now they're in the system in some way, shape, or form. They've been charged with some kind of a delinquent act. Maybe they're in some kind of a diversion program, or maybe in the community on some kind of probation supervision, or maybe they're in a custodial situation in a detention center or a long-term residential program, or some kind of supervision after those types of situations are finished. And so the young people that we're working with have an extra layer of vulnerability on top of every other layer of vulnerability that they have, because now they're system involved. Now there's people that are checking up on them. Now there's other folks that are asking questions. Now if they fail to go to school one day, there's an extra layer of accountability, because there's potentially a probation officer that's going to be checking up on them. And so they're subject to the extra surveillance that the juvenile justice system provides. And part of what we try to do at DJJ in particular is to make sure that all of our probation officers and our detention officers and our contracted staff and colleagues have an idea of what trafficking looks like, and have an idea of what kind of behaviors this young person might be engaging in. And is this related to trafficking victimization? So one of the ways that we try and minimize the recruitment of our young people, both from adults in the outside community and also from other young people that are very deep in their own victimization, is to teach them a bit about their own relationships, healthy relationship, recognize red flags in their own life, but we recognize that we're not exactly the Department of Education. We're not exactly a school, and that sometimes the kids have a very adversarial relationship with us, and that we have to be the ones to reach out and build the rapport and to help the youth to recognize that we're there to help. And sometimes that's a little easier than other times, but where we try and focus is on our staff. And if we can teach our staff how to help our kids, then we'll be able to help our kids down the road. And for recruiting, we do have policies in place that address it, but really, if folks don't understand and don't have the right training and don't pay attention to the training that they're given, then that limits our ability to really make an impact.
And Katherine, do you feel like, from your perspective, and I recognize that you're really, at a macro level here in terms of DJJ, do you feel like there is a cultural shift in how trafficking is viewed within the community, or do you feel like, you're still kind of working towards that?
Yes, no, kind of, sort of. I think nowadays, especially building on some of the work that was done before me from prior human trafficking directors at DJJ, especially Bethany Gillot, I would say that we're in a much better place now than we were several years ago. I can, trace my own experience as a probation officer back in the day, which I'm not gonna disclose exactly how far back in the day was, but it wasn't that far back. But I was a probation officer, and I had a caseload of young people that I worked with, and I would see the young people that would run away frequently, that would engage in some kind of commercial sexual activity, and I would go, oh my gosh, what is wrong with this kid? Why are they such a pain in my neck? Why are they doing this to themselves? And then once I had my first human trafficking class, and I realized, oh my gosh, I am thinking about this completely wrong. This is not what I was thinking it was. And I had that training and I learned exactly what it was I was working with. I went back to my caseload the next day and I realized, oh my goodness, I have to think about this caseload completely differently. And I know many of my colleagues had the same kind of experience. We had our first classes back in the day, and we learned a totally different perspective. And then we started putting those classes right at the beginning of training. So when probation officers first come on board, they get those classes and those trainings now. And so hopefully it's not a matter of intercepting the beliefs mid-career. It's a matter of teaching the beliefs and teaching exactly what to look for, and teaching kind of breaking down those misconceptions right at the beginning when the person comes on board. And that's something that we're doing now. But like so many elements of the anti-trafficking field, that's been an effort that's taken place in the past 10 years or so. There have been many individuals that have been working in this field for decades. But I'd say, at least in the juvenile justice system in Florida, I'd say the past 10 years or so have really been the awakening and the explosion, and the learning to do better.
Thank you so much for sharing about that. There's quite a lot of chatting going on back and forth in the chat, and I'll try to bring it back to some of those questions that are brought up. For the moment, though, Brittany, can you tell us a little bit about more about your work with Shared Hope on recruitment as well as prevention specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm all about talking about awareness and how those are both ways we can really work to fight recruitment and prevention. So at Shared Hope, I've already mentioned that we encourage parents and caregivers to empower children and youth to be responsible for themselves and safe on the internet with our internet safety series. We also provide parents and caregivers with resources to directly apply to their home internet networks and their personal devices to help keep especially really young children safe from getting exposed to a lot of the stuff we're seeing in our culture now. Shared Hope also has a large network of trained volunteers called Ambassadors of Hope, and I can share that link with you for more information there later. But we train them and they go into their communities, whether it's their local Rotary Club, schools, churches, just to raise awareness about commercial sexual exploitation and trafficking. As I mentioned before, I think so many people are unaware about what trafficking actually is and about the realities that survivors face and the vulnerabilities that lead to trafficking exploitation, and simply letting our community know that these vulnerabilities exist, that trafficking is occurring in our communities. As Katherine mentioned, I had the same perspective. Before I started with Shared Hope, I was working in for-profit event coordination, and I didn't have any, I was lucky to not have any interactions with trafficking experiences. And so I was I didn't know that it happened in my community, and I didn't know that people were being preyed on for their vulnerabilities, and that they were in these circumstances where they couldn't control necessarily being groomed. And I think just knowing that these things occur and that it's a reality for everyone in our community, for boys, for at-risk youth, I think it goes a really long way in prevention. Shared Hope also does a lot of work in grassroots advocacy. So there's a lot of state and federal legislation occurring all the time that we need support on from constituents and communities. So we have an advocacy action center right now. There's a lot of campaigns up. There's a lot of legislation that you can take action on, just as members of your community, messaging your local legislators and federal legislators to take action on some of these bills, to vote in favor of them. And they're focusing a lot on restitution for survivors, whether it's a legislation on debt bondage or housing insecurity, and understanding and learning about how those things occur and what happens, and how it's, as Jamie was mentioning, how it can be very difficult for a survivor after they've exited the life to re-enter because of what's on their record, like understanding that those things exist too is really important for the community to know. I think that goes a huge distance in learning and understanding and preventing trafficking.
Katherine, I'd like to thank you, Brittany. I'd like to go back to you a little bit more and talk specifically about specific efforts that are taking place within the Department of Juvenile Justice. Would you be willing to address that a little bit?
Sure. So one of them within DJJ is just the ongoing training efforts to make sure that everyone who comes in contact with the juvenile justice involved youth have some training in human trafficking. And what is it really? And what do we need to do about it? And then the probation officers and individuals who screen youth at the point of arrest, they have extra training in using the human trafficking screening tool, which is the jointly developed tool between DJJ and DCF, the Department of Children and Families, to screen for either sex trafficking or labor trafficking of minors, and to initiate that child abuse investigation, because all trafficking of minors is considered child abuse in the state of Florida, and so is investigated by the Florida Department of Children and Families. There's several different projects in place to initiate additional training, teaching curricula for our young people themselves to learn a bit more of what trafficking looks like, what it actually looks like, because that's frequently one of the items that we have to battle against, is that youth who are exploited may not even recognize that they're being exploited. Kind of like how Jamie mentioned earlier, if you don't see yourself in the publications that come out with the young person chained up in a basement somewhere, then you're not going to recognize that that's something that may have even happened to you. And so we are working in that direction to implement some kind of educational curricula within our detention centers and residential programs where we can educate youth. And then finally, we did incorporate recruitment into our comprehensive policies related to human trafficking, to acknowledge that our kids talk amongst themselves. They talk amongst themselves. They're always chit-chatting, and there's all sorts of information that goes back and forth between the young people. It could be just socializing. It could also be communication that contributes to criminal activity on the outside of a detention center or residential program, and it could even be something involved with recruiting other people into a trafficking situation. So we do tackle that in our internal policies, and we do teach that so that our staff have some idea of some things to listen for, like what are our kids talking about? How do we don't necessarily try and have a conversation with the youth and use the same language that the youth are using, because oftentimes we're the adults, we're so far behind the curve, they're gonna laugh at us and then just switch the language that they're using. But at least listen to what the youth are saying and pass it up through our network of human trafficking liaisons, which then comes up to Tallahassee to my office. And then we can have some idea of what's happening and where, and help to develop those networks of who is being trafficked in what neighborhoods, and try to contribute to the larger child abuse investigations and contribute to the larger law enforcement investigations that are attempting to hold the buyers and the traffickers. And in the case of minors, buyers and traffickers are the same thing. Hold everyone accountable for the victimization of our young people.
Thanks so much, Katherine. And we've had there's quite a few chats going back and forth, and we talked about this in the beginning with Jamie talking about vulnerabilities. So I'm going to kind of move into that, but I'm also going to try to integrate a little bit of what's going on in the chat into our conversation. So, often our responses are very reactive rather than proactive. We know that in our systems because we're intervening after a victimization has occurred. So one of the things that's important prevention is creating a better understanding of how survivors are lured and are groomed. And again, this is the beginning part of trafficking, and how to counteract that. one of the things that's interesting that's going on in the chat is there's some conversation back and forth about, young teens and social media and how they may have be quote unquote marketing themselves, et cetera. There was a discussion about, the 3 people that are involved in trafficking and whether or not if a teen is working on their own, or, if a teen is, quote unquote marketing themselves on the internet, is that trafficking? What is it, or, how do we address that? And then we're talking about vulnerabilities as well. So I'd like to hand it over to Jamie, because I think this is a pretty, a complicated conversation, but to kind of put it into the context of when we're talking about vulnerabilities, we're talking about, what we cite as trafficking, and especially with young adolescent teens. So I'd like to turn it over to you, Jamie.
Yeah, this is a conversation I love to have because I have a background in working with teens primarily when I was with the Open Doors Outreach Network. And I also have a digital marketing background, and I engage in a lot of digital outreach work. So I feel like the intersections of my experiences, and just even my professional experiences, not even my lived experiences, really give me some authority to kind of talk about, this topic. I think the first thing to talk about is right off, the TPVA, or I always like mix those letters up, but the Trafficking Victims Protection Act that was passed in 2000 has been reauthorized at every interval in Congress in the following years. Clearly states that, children under the age of 18, whether there is a third-party recruiter or a third-party exploiter, you don't even have to actually even have sex. Even if there's just the offer, that's all considered trafficking. And so when we start talking about like what's going on online communities, Brittany brought this up earlier, and I think it's a great point. We live more of our lives online than we ever have before. And that goes for adults and for teenagers and for preteens and even younger, with TikTok and Instagram and, everything else. And I think there's this very like reactive response from parents is that we have to like shield our children from all these technologies. And I think that's absolutely the wrong response. Everyone on this panel and on this, like in the audience, has been a teenager before. If your parents say, don't do that thing, like you're going to figure out a way to do the thing. And so it's not about, and I think to some extent there is, used to, restricting some access to internet and some access to certain sites. And, there's all sorts of technologies that can help parents with those things, but we have to create online safer communities. And the response just can't be like, you can't have online technology anymore, because that's not the world we live in. And so when we start talking about creating safer online communities, so much of the prevention and education and awareness materials and even digital outreach is really geared at parents, because they're really going to be the primary consumers of this information. And then they're going to pass that information along, to their children. I had the opportunity to create a proposal for school for a digital outreach project across the state of Florida. And it was really about bringing in youth voices on creating outreach campaigns and really creating outreach campaigns and awareness campaigns that really help youth to empower youth. When you think about teenagers, where they're at in that developmental stage is they could care less what their parents say. Like their parents are no longer the people with the knowledge that they want. Their peers are. And so how do you create a community where youth are looking out for youth, and like youth really know about trafficking and know what strategies traffickers and recruiters are going to use, and then for them themselves to be able to call out that behavior, say that's gaslighting, or you're not who you say you are, or, you know, all those other things. And so I think the youth have the knowledge about how to make their communities safer online. And I think they need to be way more involved in this process and the materials that get sent out. I've seen so many outreach materials where if I was a teenager reading that, I'm like, you just think I'm awful. Like, you think I don't know anything. You think I'm dumb. Like, and you have no idea about the world I live in. And it's because the materials are really targeted at the parents, and there's so much victim blaming language in it. And youth know when they're being blamed, you know, for things. So all of that to say, we have to create on like safer online communities. And we have to do that by getting youth involved, not just educating them. They have to be involved in the process. The other side of this is the pro-sex work lobby is loud and effective and clear, and traffickers are really effective at using technology. So we have people with the perspectives that sex work is work out there. We have traffickers who are really great at adapting and using the technology that they have for grooming and recruiting. And then we have, you know, dating apps like Brittany mentioned, but then we also have OnlyFans. And then you start thinking about all these different websites where you can go to purchase people, and or Instagram or Facebook. And when you start thinking, you know, one of the comments was made is the triangle theory no longer applies. Like, who's the exploiter here? You know, for one, if it's someone underage, there doesn't have to be an exploiter. If a child can't consent to having sex, they can't consent to selling sex. Just like, period. That's like the end of it. Like, if they're not old enough to consent to having sex with anybody, then they can't be culpable in the act of selling sex. Even if there's no one else doing it to them, they're still an adult human person saying, you're vulnerable. You got some stuff going on in your life. And instead of me doing the responsible adult thing, yeah, I'll just purchase you for sex because that's my prerogative here. So with all that being said, you know, sites like OnlyFans, where minors are not supposed to be able to get on, but absolutely can, those platforms create this environment where the people who are creating content, they're called content creators. I mean, this has all been kind of like, for lack of a better term, like whitewashed. All the like, this is selling sex has been taken out of it. So these content creators are constantly being pressured by their subscribers to make more and more scandalous type of content. I am saying OnlyFans. Someone just asked in the comments or the chat. They're asked to make more scandalous content and more evocative content. And not only are their subscribers doing that, the platform itself is doing that. They are getting emails. If people stop creating content, they are being like emailed by the organization itself, the company itself, wanting them to make more content. And so this starts looking a lot like trafficking, but in a digital age, right? The trafficker's no longer some guy like somewhere. It's now just technology, right? And recently the FOSTA SESTA, and if Tiffany wants to kind of jump in there and, you know, add what that is in the comments, you know, was passed. And part of that was to hold some of these websites accountable for the complicity in like these things happening on their sites. So that's what's when we're talking about vulnerabilities, we need safer online communities for our kids, and we do that by getting the kids involved. and we let them create the content. We let them educate their peers because they're going to do a way better job at it than we could ever do. And then we have to be aware that there is this big movement from people that sex work is work, and our kids are hearing those messages. And I read an academic research paper recently, and it called 16-year-olds consenting sex workers. It acknowledged that the Trafficking Victims Protection Act considers them victims, but so we have academics also saying, yeah, sex work is work, and even for 14 and 15-year-olds. And that's a vulnerability. The fact that we have adults who believe that. Victim blaming is a vulnerability, thinking that kids can sell themselves. Kids obviously can quote unquote sell themselves, but they can't do it on their own. Like Instagram and OnlyFans and like Facebook and online communities that don't address this, like they're not doing it on their own. It's never happening in isolation. This is not a choice they're making. What do we have to do as a community to counter that? And what do we have to do as a community to utilize technology better than traffickers and better than like pro-sex work lobbies? And there are some nuances too. I'm not necessarily completely bashing the pro-sex work lobby. I think there's a lot that we can learn from them on digital outreach and the techniques they use as far as like harm reduction and so on and so forth. So I say all of that with a respect and honoring of some of the work that they are doing, because a lot of what they want for victims and survivors, or they would say, sex workers, we use different language, but a lot of what the anti-trafficking movement wants and what the pro-sex work lobby wants is the same. There are some differences, but I think we do a lot better to learn from each other, which is another vulnerability for these kids, is that we're not willing to put our political differences aside and learn from each other.
Well, I'd like to open it up to your other colleagues here and see if there are any particular responses to what Jamie just had to say. I think it's a really interesting point and important. Brittany, do you have any reaction to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I 1000% agree with Jamie that we need to engage with youth on working with them to create safer communities online. Shared Hope just recently released a sexting video series. One is for parents to teach them what sexting is and how to have conversations with your children about it, or parents and caregivers, excuse me, because that's not an easy conversation to have. And the other was created in collaboration with youth. My colleague Kelly McCoy leaded that initiative, but she worked with some youth that are actively engaged in the anti-trafficking world, and worked with them to develop that content specifically for youth. And we also just recently launched a website specifically for youth, created by youth. She worked with a really cool graphic artist to create some of the imagery on that. So anyway, just a fun plug about that. I definitely agree that working with youth is really important, because they're the ones who are also, we can research as much as we want and try to dig in and learn, but they're the ones who are in it. They're the ones who are seeing things and experiencing things 10 times more than we are. And everything online and with social media changes so quickly. And there's so much influence there. So I think that working with youth is really important. I had another thought and I should have wrote it down. I lost my thought, but yeah, engaging with youth is really important. And I might have to come back. I have another thought and I just lost it. Excuse me.
Okay. Katherine or Alan, would you like to create or add some comments?
Sure. So I wholeheartedly agree with what Jamie said. And in our realm as well, we're the Department of Juvenile Justice. So juveniles, so individuals involved in the juvenile justice system who are primarily under the age of 18. And so we tend to not engage in the sex work lobby considerations and conversations because we're working primarily with minors. And when we're working with minors, the concept of the consenting sex worker as a minor is not a relevant concept in our world. Anyone who's engaged in the commercial sex industry who is under the age of 18 is a trafficking victim according to state and federal law, period, end of story. So that's where we start and where we finish. And so we will automatically assume that anyone who is engaged in the commercial sex industry is a trafficking victim, and we will presume the victimization and report it over to the Department of Children and Families to be investigated as child abuse. Now, when we do encounter the occasional individual who's 18 years old or older, we will still ask the same kinds of questions to try to ascertain whether they are engaged in the commercial sex industry or whether they are being trafficked for their labor in some way, shape, or form. But at the end of the day and at the end of that conversation, if we do identify that there are some risk factors that ordinarily, if that person was under the age of 18, we would be reporting over to the child abuse hotline. We do ask 18-year-olds and young people older than 18, we do ask them for consent before we make a call over to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, because we do recognize that 18-year-olds are different than minors, and we cannot presume that they are a trafficking victim, even though we may have just completed a conversation with them and every single one of the red flags is telling us that this person is most likely a trafficking victim. We still respect their autonomy as legal adults and wait for their consent before we call it into the national hotline, or hand them the phone and they can call it in themselves if they would like to.
So much, Katherine. Alan, please go ahead.
Yeah, I've been sitting here burning because I hear these conversations. I'm like, man, what Jamie said is so true. I hear the comments, and she was talking about the human trafficking triangle. In the case of a minor, the buyer and the trafficker may be one and the same. They don't have to be three persons, but there are three activities that's happening around that crime of human trafficking. I will also highlight, and again, this does not make me popular, and that's okay. I will highlight that sometimes the trafficker is, in my view, some of this big tech. We talk about Twitter and Facebook and some of these that are driving that conversation. These websites, these dating websites, including Plenty of Fish and you name them, that are out there talking about putting these minors online for sale. They're a trafficker, in my view. They're not a company anymore. They have become a trafficker because they're exploiting these young people who cannot consent. So those three actions are still in place. So that triangle remains true, even though there may be one or two players, those activities are there. And sometimes it's the tech itself. It's going to be those facilitators that are asking for more content, as Jamie talked about. They're asking them for a more exploitive photograph because they can make more. That absolutely is a trafficking activity. And I think they need to be held in account. The only other thing that I will say is I sat in the kitchen of a domestic violence shelter, and across the table sat someone who wanted to talk to somebody about possibly being trafficked. I'll never forget that discolored table that sat between her and I, and she began to talk about her lived experience. And in that lived experience, she gave some gut-wrenching details of rapes and sexual abuses and private parties and dancing in strip clubs and being exploited while she was in those strip clubs. While she was talking, in came running a little 2-year-old boy that was her child. And I asked her, I said, have you been branded? And we were talking about brands, and she showed me a barcode that had been put on the back of her neck that her trafficker had put on her. And I said, was there a particular reason why he used a barcode? And she said, and I'll never forget, because it broke my heart sitting there in that kitchen when she began to weep and the tears began to drip off of her chin and pull on that table. And she looked at me and she said, because I'm only worth $25. Her value in her own mind was $25. And during the course of that conversation that I had, and I had the opportunity to talk to her on 3 different occasions, sitting in that same kitchen on 3 different occasions. And I'll never forget her talking about, because we talked about recruiting and text-to recruiting and the grooming. And she talked about how she worked in a Nestor club, and a Nestor club is where they choose up for their pimp. And she was working in this Nestor club, and she chose her pimp. She chose up her pimp, and she talked about blades and street tracks. She talked about all of her lived experience online being sold and some of those kind of things that were happening to her. She made another statement for those that are sitting on this call. She said, my pimp, one of the places that he's recruiting girls right now is out of churches, because he says that's the easiest place to find vulnerable victims. So my point is that we're not in safe places when we're talking about this. They're recruiting in places that we're not even considering. And there's a lot of things that are happening. But my point is simply this. When I talked to that young lady, she mentioned the breakdown in 4 different areas that I'll never forget as long as I live. She talked about the breakdown of her family. She talked about the breakdown of a medical community where she had went into an emergency room. She talked about law enforcement arresting her for masking crimes and how that she had to try, and now she felt hopeless because how am I going to come out from under all of these charges that I have? And then the breakdown of the system, a bureaucratic system that was put in place supposedly to help, but sometimes brings in barriers and challenges. And so my thought when I walked away from that place after talking to her and listening to her story was simply this: we can do better. We must do better. We must challenge ourselves. We must become agents of change and hope, because that's the way we're going to change the system. We're going to do this somehow, some way. We're going to do this, and we're going to stop this from happening. We have to stop this from happening.
Thank you so much, Alan, for appreciating or for adding that. And certainly, I think a lot of our audience was really touched by the story that you had and that individual that you had talked with. We're kind of rounding out to the end here. And so I just wanted to give everyone an opportunity to just talk about the one thought that you want to leave the audience with when we're talking about this particular topic and what you would like them to remember about today. So I'm going to start with Brittany. Brittany, please.
Sure. Thank you again for having me today and for allowing me to participate with these awesome panelists. I would just like to reiterate my point about being responsible in our messaging and not sensationalizing the occurrences of trafficking and sexual exploitation to protect our survivor community and also to protect the youth who are seeing those sensationalized images and not realizing that these occurrences of trafficking could be happening in their conversations that they're having online. We need to be honest about what trafficking and exploitation is, and so that we can identify recruitment scenarios. And I also want to encourage people to ask why and to dig deeper and to understand the vulnerabilities that take place. Look into advocacy so that you can learn more about some of the instabilities that might lead to vulnerabilities, like housing instability, debt bondage, things that occur that, opportunities that we have to build opportunities for survivors when they exit the life, and to also, use that education that we learn from them and their experiences so that we can prevent those circumstances in the first place. So thank you for letting me share.
Great. Thank you so much, Brittany. I'll move to Katherine.
Sure. So 2 items. One is to listen to the survivors and listen to anybody who has lived experience that can talk about this in a completely different way than I can or anyone can that hasn't been through it. The second item I would say is that when we're having conversations in our day-to-day life, to try and not prejudge what we're listening to, because this, especially for us in the juvenile justice system, as young people come to assimilate what they've been through, learn what they've been through, understand what they've been through, and maybe even recognize that they may have even harmed other people in the course of their own victimization. It's important that they still feel supported and still feel like they are worth our time and attention, and that they haven't crossed over and somehow crossed over into the realm of the bad guys. They still need our time and our attention and our support, and our non-judgmental listening and open minds. And then finally, I would say that even though this particular conversation has been focused on individuals engaged in the sex industry and sex trafficking specifically, we cannot forget individuals who have experienced exploitation for their labor, all kinds of other types of labor. And that may or may not cross over with sexual exploitation, but the recruitment tactics to get people to work in fields that are particularly vulnerable for trafficking is something that we cannot forget about. So we talk a lot about sex trafficking and labor trafficking as two very different things, but they in many ways can overlap with one another, because the key at the end of the day is the vulnerability. What are the vulnerabilities that a trafficker is targeting? And to go back to what Jamie had said, what is the trafficker doing to target this person? Not what vulnerabilities does the victim have. What is the trafficker targeting? And to keep that attention there, but to recognize that at least for us in the juvenile justice system, our minors, they may have been through a million and one different things, and they may be ready to talk about it. They may not be ready to talk about it, but at least we can build the rapport and plant the seeds of trust so that that youth will hopefully talk to us about it, and we can link them up with organizations that can help them and start that child abuse investigation process.
Thank you, Katherine. I'll turn to Jamie.
Katherine, you were first. I'll be the last to talk on you. As I'm, sitting here reflecting and hearing everybody, add their own reflections. I really appreciate, Katherine, the idea of we have to stop thinking about this in like such a binary way of like, good guys and bad guys and all of that. It really is an oversimplification with so like many layers. And I think when you try to take a more nuanced approach to understanding grooming and recruitment and understanding trafficking, when you think about that, like traffickers target these vulnerabilities. Well, why? Like, why those vulnerabilities? And why are those vulnerabilities so prevalent in our community? And what can we as community members do to address those things and make sure people have the right social safety networks? They have the right support that, I saw someone in the comments say that their 12-year-old's been, reached out online, multiple times. And that teenager has felt comfortable enough to go to their parent and tell them about that. How do we cultivate that in families and communities? How do we make it safe for kids to come forward with that kind of information? It does look a little bit different. I was a, teenager going to a concert and, had some guy offer me a handful of like pills and I didn't take them. This was before I was ever trafficked or anything else, but I never told my parents about it. I was so afraid that they would never let me go to a concert again, that I just never said anything about it. So how do we, and if it can't happen in families, how do we make sure kids have like mentors? And I just saw one comment in the chat box that asked, for survivors who want to come forward and like share their stories and, how do they do that? And, where do they do that at? My advice would be to connect with another survivor and get informed consent about what sharing your story looks like. I didn't have that. And so now my name is attached to my survivorship and will be for the rest of my life, unless I change my actual legal name and have a pseudonym for my real life. And so that is a choice that people can make for themselves. But I would recommend, before they get in contact with any organization or anything else, I would recommend that they get a mentor who's a survivor, who can walk them through the nuances of what it means to go public, and also talk about all the different ways that you can share your experience without going public.
Thank you so much, Jamie. And I'm gonna leave this last minute to Alan. Alan, what would you like us to remember about this particular topic?
Well, first of all, the last minute, I heard that minute. First of all, I just want to say what an honor it is to be with all this panelists that are here. And to you, Micheala, thank you for the great job of doing this and hosting this panel. This has been amazing. I've learned much being a part of this panel as well. The only thing I would say is that as humans, change is not the most comfortable thing. And when challenged to change, we oftentimes meet that with a resistance. And that resistance is called self-preservation. We don't necessarily like to change. And so we kind of default back to self-preservation. And since organizations and agencies and governments and non-government organizations are all made up of humans, we oftentimes have a systemic resistance to change. And when challenged to change, even organizations and systems and governments become self-preserved, and they kind of resist that change. So what I would say today is to the leaders of organizations and agencies that are out here today, continue that downward pressure to change the culture, the way we think about things, the way we talk, our language that we use. And to those of you who may not be in positions to change organizations, I would encourage you to be that agent of change, that agent of hope, be that pressure point that affects all of us to be better with what we do. And the last thing that I would say is, until all are truly free, all of us need to be the hope for the hopeless, a voice for the voiceless. We need to be a light in dark places. Let's all be those agents of change, those agents of hope. We can do this. We have to do this. Let's make a difference. Thank you to everyone that was on this call. Let's be a difference.
On behalf of Voices for Florida and the Florida Alliance Against Human Trafficking, I'd like to thank all of our panelists. We will be sending some follow-up emails with additional contact information for our panelists, as well as information on some of the resources that were shared. Have a lovely afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us.